Hello, everyone. Santir here, and today I want to talk about a challenge that the people, I guess, in charge of Star Wars these days have to deal with. So, what they're doing is they're taking something that someone created, George Lucas, and they're trying to figure out what's the best way to kind of continue working with it. And what this ultimately kind of leads to is the difference between a creator of a work and a maintainer, I suppose you could say, or somebody who's trying to duplicate what they did in many regards. So the way that I'm kind of framing this thought is like the difference between like making a masterpiece versus trying to duplicate them. So when you just talking about from like a master painter standpoint. So when you look at something like the Mona Lisa, which is the popular example, or like Van Gogh's Starry Night is probably even more potent in this regard. If you want, like, the process of creating that is very different from trying to recreate it. Because when you're trying to recreate it, you're trying to go for all of the precise details. So the first time, when it's being created the first time, and this is actually just a duplication, like a manual duplication anytime you're dealing with it. But something like Starry Night, Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night is very clear for how this works. He did not most likely spend a ton of time trying to precisely position every part of the stroke. Like, it was a stroke, and then he put in another stroke, and just however things kind of organically kind of came together as he's laying on the paint is, what ends up going into that result. But when you're trying to replicate it, you have to care about every single little detail. You have to care about how the strokes are interacting to try to completely capture that same piece. Or at least that's an approach to trying to do it if you're trying to make the exact same thing. And so what we see with an IP or a property like Star Wars is when George Lucas is working on it, he's the master. His style will inherently come through his work. Now, whether or not people like his style is another matter entirely. But when somebody else takes the reins, they have to figure out how they're approaching the work. Are they going to try to approach it in a way that is trying to adhere to what they understand George Lucas as trying to do when he was making Star Wars? Are they going to try to make it from the standpoint of a fan doing what they would want to do in that world? Are they going to try to approach it critically, where they're trying to subvert what they don't like about it? Like, there's different ways to approach it, but it's inherently different when somebody else approaches the category of work, for lack of a better phrase, than when the original person does it themselves. And so what you end up having is a couple of different scenarios. So, for example, you can either get really caught up in a lot of the details, where you're trying to make something that's precisely what the original Star Wars films, or George Lucas' Star Wars films were. And when you do that, what you're going to run into as a problem is it's going to feel too derivative. It's going to feel too samey, because you're afraid to break new ground, because you don't want to accidentally break something. And that has its own set of issues. But if you reinterpret through your own creative lens, you're going to begin to lose potentially some of the feel that the original stuff had, because each creator approaches things differently. So you're going to break ground that would be different than what the original creator would break. And so it's going to result in different ways that things are going to work, which to some extent I think is an argument for why having intellectual property on premises is a little wonky. Like, this is kind of a side topic, but I think it's worth delving into a little bit. When we look at the way George Lucas approaches doing Star Wars versus the way somebody else approaches doing it, they're going to feel different. They're going to have different flavors, unless somebody's really, really, really trying to duplicate George, at which point it's going to feel derivative in a way, whereas George Lucas can have more originality in what he's doing with it, because, like, he is the original, and trying to duplicate the original means that you're stuck with only doing what the original did, whereas the original knows, like, can expand in directions. Am I making clear on that? I don't know if I'm being clear. Also, I feel like I'm sounding really congested. I'm sorry, I have allergies right now. Anyway, So you have some of that where it's like there's different flavors that can kind of start to come out, and it's like, how much do you want? Because one of the problems that you can run into is if you wander too far from the original, then you're going to lose what people liked about it potentially. And this is actually really interesting sort of follow along conversation. So the original creator of something has a mixture of how they're making stuff. And people will like those things for various reasons. And when you change something about a work, there are going to be people who like the change because you didn't change the thing that they liked and you kept the thing that they liked, and you changed something they didn't like as much or didn't matter as much to them to maybe something they like more. And you're going to have people that don't like the change because what you changed is the thing that they liked. So you have to be really careful how you're approaching it. For example, Star Wars Episode 8, Ryan, I keep wanting to pronounce his name Ryan, but it's apparently Ryan. The guy kind of in charge of that one really tried to do a lot of subverting of Star Wars tropes. And I think he's way too aggressive with it. It reminds me of something Mark Rosewater said about how he could make a Magic the Gathering set that didn't feel like Magic the Gathering, and that would be a problem. And so he has the challenge of trying to make something new while changing just enough, but only changing just enough to make it actually like new, like feel new without being so far distant from Magic that doesn't feel like Magic anymore. I don't feel like I articulated that very well, but it's the idea that he has to change enough to make it feel new, but not so much that it doesn't have some of the old feel, it doesn't feel like Magic anymore. It's kind of the sentiment I was trying to express there. And I think part of the problem with Episode 8 is Ryan was trying to subvert so much that he ended up making it not feel like Star Wars to a lot of people. Now, from my standpoint, I find Star Wars to be a really interesting thing to study, and calling myself a Star Wars fan feels really weird. I certainly was a fan of it as a kid growing up, and you can see that, like, George Lucas made Star Wars films for kids. He didn't make them for adults, and part of what is so clear about that is he was, like, they're fundamentally films about nostalgia, and they're also very simplified. So he was taking stuff that he was nostalgic about and making a movie out of it, but he also simplified a lot of concepts. So it's kind of like a samurai film crossed with a western set in a space setting. It's not sci-fi. It's so not sci-fi. I know people have tried. They've really tried, but it's not sci-fi. But anyway, it's like a futuristic fantasy setting, because lightsabers are impractical. So, but they're really cool. Anyway, so where I'm going with a lot of this is when you're working in a creative medium, like, as you change things, what gets changed is naturally going to affect some people. And like Star Wars, yeah, it uses a very simplified structure of like, what's the hero's journey? But then the prequels are really interesting because they're not exploring the hero's journey in quite the same way, and they're exploring like what can cause somebody who has the potential to be a hero to go bad. And actually, this is very controversial, but my favorite Star Wars film is Episode 3, because all the clues are there if you know to look for them of why Anakin goes to the dark side. And I think it's really interesting to see what happens, the way the Jedi lose the trust of Anakin and send him down the dark path. It's really interesting to me. But it's not a great film, but sort of the underlying psychological things that are happening are just really interesting to me. And you can see the little moments where the Jedi are losing Anakin without them, and they don't even realize it. And I think it's really interesting to see all that psychology kind of happen. The problem is the performances that were directed and chosen. I imagine many of these actors could provide much better performances, but so some amount has to go into George Lucas's hands as like director and chief editor. So it doesn't. The script and all of those things don't do a really good job of displaying it very well, but they are there if you look for them. But anyway, I've gotten kind of off topic. So what we have in the case of Episode 8 is it just changed so much, and it tried to do things so differently that it didn't have the right feel, it didn't have the right ring, it didn't feel like Star Wars to people. It tried to change too much, it tried to subvert too much. And if you subvert things, you have to do it very intentionally, very carefully. And you're still going to alienate people. But if you do it well, you can get people to think. And if you do it too aggressively, you just turn people off. And that's what really happened. So, anyway, what I kind of get back to here is like trying to work in a property and trying to figure out what makes that property. Why do people like it? What do people gravitate to? Is a better way to try to maintain it and try to understand what is this property at its core than like trying to duplicate the masterpiece too closely, as it were. Duplicating the original too closely ends up leaving people feeling like they didn't really get anything new, and so it can feel very derivative and like unoriginal in ways that are some people are going to like and other people are really going to not like. And that's always what it comes down to. Is whenever you create something new, you're going to, that's like a continuation of something. It's going to affect people in different ways. A really good example of this actually is Supernatural, that TV show, where some people really do not like how it changed from the original seasons. They don't like the addition of Castiel. They don't like the bunker and all that sort of stuff. And other people really like those things. And I hear about it from my sister who's into it, and I watch the show with her, but some of that fan stuff is intense. And that's all I'm going to say on it. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts about some of these difficulties. And like, I definitely feel, in terms of my personal feelings about like what do I want to see from Star Wars, I just want to see them continuing to try to explore interesting ideas. And one of the things that I appreciate about Lucas's era of the Star Wars films, the original and prequel trilogies, is that I really feel like he was trying to dig into certain ideas. He's trying to understand or dig into like the hero's journey, or what makes a hero fall, what makes a hero go from being a hero to being a villain. And that's something that he explores in the prequels. And I don't know what Star Wars is going to be about under Disney's leadership. Like, I don't know who's in charge of it exactly, but I don't know what it's about. And the problem is, what I've seen from Abrams is what he's made Star Wars is about is celebrating Star Wars. And that's not about something deeper. It's a shallow experience. Lucas at least had some depth to his experience. Simplified as it was, there was something in there. Ryan just seems to be like angry, rejecting all of the tropes of Star Wars. And it feels like, what is this about? So we'll see. But anyway, that's probably me going off on too much of a tangent there. Or not. It's my show. It can be whatever I want it to be, right? Anyway, whoever is in charge of a property, though, I do want them to try to understand what to them is the core of that property, and to try to build it on something and not just make it a self-homaging thing. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and close here. And until next time, everyone, take care. Bye-bye.